At 79 years old, David Gilmour sits in his countryside home, surrounded by the ghosts of melodies that once made the world weep. The man who could make a single guitar note pierce through decades of noise now faces a silence he never chose. Not the artistic silence that made him legendary, but the devastating quiet of watching everything he built slowly fade into memory.
The tragedy isn't that he's aging.
The tragedy is that the world has forgotten how to listen to the language he spent a lifetime perfecting. You see, David Gilmour never needed volume to command attention. While his contemporaries screamed into microphones and smashed instruments for applause, Gilmour whispered through his guitar strings and made stadiums fall silent. He was the antithesis of rock and roll excess, a man who found more power in restraint than others found in rebellion. But that very restraint, that quiet genius that elevated Pink Floyd from a band into a spiritual experience, has become both his greatest triumph and his most profound curse. Born into the intellectual coldness of Cambridge in 1946, young David learned early that love wasn't always spoken aloud. His father, a distinguished zoologist, and his mother, a BBC journalist, provided everything except the warmth a sensitive child craves. The house was filled with academic discourse and scholarly achievement but empty of the emotional nourishment that feeds an artist's soul. David once described his childhood as existing in a forgotten void, not because of cruelty or neglect, but because of an absence so subtle it took decades to understand its impact. It was this early isolation that forged the man who would later channel loneliness into comfortably numb and transform personal pain into the haunting beauty of Shine On You Crazy Diamond. The 10-year-old boy who taught himself guitar in solitude, hour after hour, wasn't just learning chords. He was developing a language for emotions too complex for words, creating a vocabulary of bends and sustains that would eventually speak to millions who felt equally lost. But here's what makes David's story so heartbreaking now. The same sensitivity that allowed him to create music of unprecedented emotional depth also made him vulnerable to wounds that never fully healed. The quiet boy who learned to express himself through 6 strings grew into a man who carried every slight, every creative betrayal, and every moment of artistic compromise like stones in his chest.
And at 79, those stones haven't disappeared.
They've simply grown heavier with time, creating a weight that no amount of musical success could ever lift.
The tragedy of David Gilmour isn't about what he lost. It's about what he carries.
The cruelest irony of David Gilmour's life began in 1967, when opportunity arrived disguised as catastrophe. Pink Floyd was ascending towards something extraordinary, but their creative leader, Syd Barrett, was disappearing into the fractured landscape of his own mind. LSD had unlocked doors in Barrett's consciousness that could never be closed again, leaving him unable to perform, unable to connect, unable to be the visionary the band desperately needed. And so they called David, the quiet boy from Cambridge who had once shared innocent jam sessions with Syd during their art school days. What should have been David's greatest triumph became his first great wound.
He wasn't chosen because he was the best guitarist in London.
He was chosen because he was reliable, because he could replicate Syd's parts without the chaos, and because he would show up when Syd couldn't. From the very beginning, David Gilmour was living in another man's shadow, playing another man's dreams, carrying the ghost of someone who was still alive but already gone. Imagine being 19 years old and watching your childhood friend slip away into madness while simultaneously being asked to replace him in the thing he loved most. Every night on stage, David saw the confusion in Barrett's eyes, the man who had once been brilliant now struggling to remember basic chords. And every night, David had to step forward and play the songs that Syd could no longer deliver, feeling like both a savior and a betrayer.
The press didn't help.
For years after Barrett's departure, critics referred to Pink Floyd as Syd Barrett's former band, as if David's contributions were merely maintenance work on someone else's masterpiece. They had no idea that the young man quietly standing on the stage left was already composing the sonic architecture that would define not just Pink Floyd, but the entire landscape of progressive rock. While others chased recognition, David built cathedrals of sound in the shadows.
But here's what cut deepest: Barrett never fully went away.
He would appear at recording sessions uninvited, standing silently in the corner with his head shaved and his eyes vacant, a living reminder of the creative fire that David could never fully replace. The band would find him in the studio, saying nothing, just watching them create music in the space he had once occupied. For David, these encounters weren't just awkward, they were existential wounds, constant reminders that he was inhabiting someone else's dreams.
This is where David's tragedy truly began.
Not with failure, but with success that came at the cost of his own identity. Every beautiful note he played carried the weight of being second choice, every moment of brilliance shadowed by the question of whether he was living his own life or simply maintaining someone else's legacy. By the early 1970s, David Gilmour had quietly become Pink Floyd's musical soul, but another storm was gathering. Roger Waters, the band's bassist and primary lyricist, was evolving from collaborator into dictator. Where David spoke through melody and emotion, Waters wielded concepts and control. What had once been a partnership of complementary strengths was becoming a battleground for Pink Floyd's artistic identity, and David, true to his nature, fought his battles in silence. The success of The Dark Side of the Moon should have been pure triumph. Instead, it marked the beginning of David's longest artistic imprisonment. While the world celebrated the album's genius, David knew a painful truth: his most emotionally transcendent guitar work was being used as decoration for Roger's increasingly domineering vision. Time, money, comfortably numb, these weren't David's songs, they were Roger's concepts brought to life by David's hands. The man who could make a guitar cry was slowly being reduced to a session musician in his own band. The tragedy deepened with each album. Wish You Were Here saw David pouring his grief for Syd Barrett into Shine on You Crazy Diamond, creating what many consider the most emotionally devastating guitar sequence ever recorded. Yet even this deeply personal expression of loss was appropriated by Waters as part of his broader artistic statement. David's pain became Roger's concept, his tears transformed into someone else's vision. But it was the wall that truly broke something inside David Gilmour. Here was an album that became one of the most successful rock records in history, anchored by David's legendary solo on Comfortably Numb, a piece of music so profound it transcends genre and generation. Yet he was essentially a hired gun on his own band's masterpiece, playing notes written in service of Roger's autobiographical opera. The solo that millions consider the greatest guitar moment in rock history was created by a man who was slowly losing his voice in his own group. What makes this period so heartbreaking is how David handled it. He didn't explode in interviews, didn't stage public rebellions, didn't air the band's dirty laundry for the press. Instead, he channeled his frustration into his playing, making each note carry the weight of unspoken resentment and suppressed creativity. Listen to his work on Animals or The Final Cut. You can hear a man screaming through his fingertips while maintaining perfect composure everywhere else. The quiet man was being slowly erased from his own legacy, and the world celebrated the beauty of his suffering without ever knowing what it cost him to create it. When Roger Waters finally left Pink Floyd in 1985, declaring the band dead and launching a vicious legal war to prevent David from continuing, the world expected liberation. Instead, David Gilmour found himself facing his greatest tragedy yet, the realization that some wounds never heal, they just change shape. At 41, he had finally won control of his own artistic destiny, but victory felt hollow when earned through the destruction of relationships that had defined his entire adult life. The legal battles were bruising enough. Waters sued to prevent the remaining members from using the Pink Floyd name, claiming David was nothing more than a sideman attempting to capitalize on another man's vision. For years, lawyers argued over who owned the soul of a band, reducing decades of musical collaboration to contractual disputes and financial settlements. But the real damage wasn't happening in courtrooms, it was happening in David's heart. Here was a man who had spent 2 decades being too quiet, too accommodating, too willing to subsume his own identity for the greater good. And what did his selflessness earn him? A former friend who publicly dismissed his contributions, a media narrative that painted him as an opportunist, and the crushing responsibility of proving that Pink Floyd could exist without its most vocal advocate. The quiet man was finally free to speak, but he had forgotten how to use his voice for anything other than music. A momentary lapse of reason and The Division Bell weren't just albums, they were David's desperate attempts to prove his own worth, not just to the world, but to himself. Every note carried the weight of justification, every song a response to critics who suggested Pink Floyd died with Waters' departure. The tragic irony is that these albums contain some of David's most beautiful work, High Hopes, Wearing the Inside Out and Learning to Fly, yet they were created by a man consumed with proving he deserved to exist. By the time David reached his 70s, the pattern was set. He had achieved everything a musician could dream of: legendary status, financial security, critical acclaim, and the love of millions. But inside, he remained the 10-year-old boy playing guitar alone in his room, still wondering if anyone was truly listening, still carrying the weight of being second choice, replacement, the quiet one in the corner. The man who spent his life making others feel less alone had never fully escaped his own isolation. At 79, David Gilmour possesses one of music's most recognizable voices, yet he still struggles to believe anyone wants to hear what he has to say. Today, at 79, David Gilmour sits in his studio, surrounded by guitars that have moved millions to tears, yet he still questions whether his voice matters. The tragedy isn't that age has diminished his abilities, his recent performances prove his fingers still carry magic. The tragedy is that a lifetime of being overlooked, overshadowed, and undervalued has left scars that no amount of success can heal. In 2019, he shocked the music world by auctioning his entire guitar collection, including the legendary black Strat that created Comfortably Numb, donating over $21 million to charity. When asked why, he simply said he didn't need to hold on to things to prove anything. But perhaps the truth is darker, perhaps he still doesn't believe he deserves to own the instruments that created so much beauty. His marriage to Polly Samson brought stability, creativity, and genuine partnership to his life. Yet even in his happiness, shadows linger. When Roger Waters made controversial political statements in recent years, and Polly publicly condemned him, David's response was telling: "I stand by every word my wife has said." Even in righteous anger, even when defending his family, David Gilmour couldn't find his own words. He stood behind someone else's voice, just as he had done his entire career. The man who gave us Wish You Were Here, who made time eternal, who crafted guitar solos that serve as emotional guideposts for entire generations, still sees himself as the replacement, the backup, the one who stepped in when others stepped out. He created music that will outlive us all, yet remains haunted by the feeling that he was never supposed to be the one creating it. This is David Gilmour's tragedy, not that he failed, but that he succeeded so completely while never fully believing he deserved to. At 79, he has given the world a language for loneliness, a soundtrack for introspection, and a masterclass in turning pain into beauty. Yet the boy who learned to speak through guitar strings still wonders if anyone is truly listening. In a world that grows louder and more chaotic each day, David Gilmour's quiet genius feels both more precious and more fragile. He taught us that the most profound statements are whispered, not shouted, that the deepest truths come from silence, not noise. But the heartbreaking irony remains: the man who made silence beautiful has never found peace in his own quiet moments. What moments in David Gilmour's music have spoken to your own silent struggles? Share your thoughts below, and remember to subscribe as we continue exploring the beautiful tragedies of music's greatest souls.